Greetings on the day of the Epiphany, a day which is quickly, in a matter of hours, being overtaken by the Theophany, which leaves one little time to contemplate the impact of the visit of the Magi. In fact, in the Eastern Church, the celebration already focuses on the baptism of our Lord. For us in the West, we are spared by this quick transition from an overwrought imagination of the West that parlayed the event into an ornate extravaganza of camels, kings, and extravagant gifts of gold and incense and myrrh. But there is in that no redress to the problem that we pass over too lightly the effect of the visit, which according to Matthew was that a flight into Egypt was demanded of the family. While the flight into Egypt is questioned by scholars, having only a single reference in Matthew, the fact is that there are a string of references down the Nile River which claim to preserve the memory of the family's travel down to Qusqam, a village 170 miles from Cairo, up the Nile River. It also has allowed for the passing over of Joseph and his role in the incarnation, which must have been more than being just a dutifully most chaste spouse. Joseph must have had a substantial role in the formation of the Christ. Joseph was around enough for Jesus to become a carpenter and to have brothers and sisters. One might wonder if his voice is ever echoed in that of Jesus. My candidate for this is when Jesus replies to the Pharisees who have come to him to tell him that Herod was seeking his life. He replies, "Go tell that fox." It strikes me as a bit more salty than lordly. In my book on Giving My Word, there is a narrative beginning on page 165. It's entitled, "The Journey of Joseph and the Family into Egypt." I'm going to read this evening a section of that, which imagines the visions and its aftermath. It should be remembered that the visit of the Magi in Matthew is not to a stable, but to a house. Also, Herod orders that the children of 2 years and under be killed, implying that the Magi's visits took place something like a year or more after the birth. The title of this section, "The Loss of Bethlehem a Second Time." Joseph had wasted no time in settling his wife Mary and their infant son in the little house provided by his family. It was, to be sure, small and run down, but the garden plot and the modest pasture west of the town bode well for its possibilities. The shepherd's daughter, who had been about 10 and who had been in on the birth, came to live with them. She doted on the child and was a great help to Mary. The shepherd's youngest son, the one Joseph met in the gate, showed up early daily for work as a day laborer for Joseph, and Joseph in turn taught the boy his trade and believed that he would do much for the shepherd's town, which had taken them in when no one else would. It was not by any means a full restitution of the property that Joseph had left behind when he had been forced to flee Bethlehem, but it would provide a living for his family, and it satisfied him. The clan, in turn, was pleased to see the ruin return to prosperity and their numbers augmented, especially given that his little one was a boy. Joseph continued to be disciplined, very disciplined, in his commitment not to start trouble. The only rub with the family was that from time to time, women from the other side of the town came to visit the child, which they had delivered. Clearly, they established a close bond with Mary and she with them. And from time to time, Joseph went to the other side of town and did things as a carpenter for those who were called the people of the land. That does not, however, stop the extended family of Bethlehem from embracing his young, charming wife and his handsome son. Joseph even began to study Torah, and he was called to read from time to time in the village synagogue. The dream was happening. That is, until a strange and unexpected event intervened to change their lives yet again. As usual, it was the kids running in the street that had brought the news that something was about to happen. A strange retinue of travelers had arrived in town. The dress of the leading men made it clear that they were foreigners of some special standing, not kings or priests, but as they had announced, men devoted to wisdom. It was flattering for the town to be visited by such a retinue. Their inquiries led them to the house of Joseph and Mary. The townspeople had looked on as the men talked with Joseph. He had taken the men into the house, where it is said that they praised the child, and he had given them and had given him elaborate gifts. The townspeople, including the family, sensed that this was an auspicious visit that would place Bethlehem on the map, and that somehow they themselves might benefit from this stroke of fortune. The retinue of these distinguished visitors, who had waited in the yard, could not refrain from impressing the gathering of extended family and neighbors. They bragged about their recent reception at the palace of King Herod, and indeed they boasted that they had been invited to return to his court after they had completed their mission. They could hardly wait for return to the king's lavish hospitality. Everyone had been impressed by this and imagined themselves being guests at the palace. When evening came, Joseph was once again suddenly aware of his cousin's presence. It was Jacob that began. "I regret to say this, but this is not good." "I behave most respectfully," Joseph replied defensively. "It's the notice. It's not good in our view to be noticed. The Herodians are bound to poke their nose into this sooner or later." "They were just curious old men, that's all they were. They meant no one harm, I promise you," Joseph had rebutted his cousin's allegations. But at the same time, he knew that he himself had been uneasy about the visit well before his cousin had come. That night he watched Mary play with the child, coaxing steps out of him. When they had laid down to sleep, where sleep had been so pleasant for the last several months, soon he was aware that Mary was sleeping soundly, and that for him it was going to be one of those difficult nights when sleep would come only in fits and starts. When it had come, it was full of dread and struggle. Somewhere in the struggle, a voice was saying ever more clearly, "You must leave Bethlehem immediately, for the life of the child is at risk." He lay there in the dark, realizing that his heart was racing and that he was covered with sweat. The implausible destination of Egypt that the voice had designated for his flight seemed preposterous. The great ancestor for whom he had been named had gone into Egypt, it is true, but he had gone not by choice, but as a prisoner and as a slave. Indeed, the Torah forbade it, for it is written in the scroll of Genesis, "You shall not return to Egypt." He swore to himself that he would not go into Egypt as long as he was free. While he had doubts about the truth of the voice that he had heard in his half-sleep, He was so full of dread that he could not but act upon its advice. He had shaken his poor wife awake in the middle of the night. He knew that this frenzy was terrifying her as she speechlessly followed his instructions. There was in his mind no other way. When he tried to explain to Mary why they must leave immediately, it made no sense to her. The idea of being uprooted again troubled her. Joseph was sensitive to her pain and tried to be patient. Reluctantly, and with the vague promise that it might be nothing more than spending a few days away in Hebron, Mary yielded to the plan. And so quietly in the dark of night, they slipped out of Bethlehem without telling anybody and took the road south down the spine of the hill country to Hebron. Hebron, Joseph had told Mary as they walked along, was also a town that belonged to the tribe of Judah. And from there, David had reigned over Judah for 10 years before the other tribes called him to be their king as well. They could come to feel at home there as much as they had in Bethlehem. At any rate, he assured her, as soon as things had blown over in Bethlehem, they would return. There was really nothing to fear. He tried hard to convince her without being able to convince himself that the trip to Hebron was merely a temporary precaution and that there was nothing to fear. Well, you can read the rest of that story on Giving My Word. I always find in the weeks following Christmas that it is helpful in my imagination to journey with the Holy Family. It will be fraught this year with the fact that it will take me across Gaza and down an unsettled Nile River and back. But traversing this territory overflowing with refugees, both ancient and modern, makes keeping company with Joseph, Mary, and the child, refugees themselves, all the more poignant. In our session in February, for First Thursday, we will look at the way the Word becomes text, and in effect, the existence that text has had on the church and the world. See you on First Thursday of February, which will happen to be the first day of the month.